Well, good morning, Nona Church family. On behalf of my wife, Stacy, and the rest of our leadership team here at Nona, we want to say thank you so much for trusting us with your time today. We hope you're having a great summer filled with lots of sun and laughter and making great memories with those you love. Speaking of summer fun, each year around this time, our family gets away for a few weeks to reset, recharge, and prepare for the next season of ministry. And each summer, we try to bring in voices we value to invest in the life of our community. And this year, we have the privilege of hearing from none other than Pastor John Hampton. For the next few weeks, we'll be in a series titled Summer Camp with Pastor John. And like a good camp counselor, Pastor John will be our guide as we navigate these coming weeks in the summer. And after 40 years of ministry and preaching, Pastor John has some incredible wisdom to share with us. In this series, he will be sharing some of his most downloaded and impactful messages with our church to encourage us, inspire us, and prepare us for our future as a church in the fall. Pastor John is no stranger to the Nona Church family. In fact, he's more like Papa John at this point, as he's led ministry retreats for our staff, taught in our Sunday services, and poured into so many here at our church. Church family, you mean the world to me, and I'm so grateful that while we're away, you get to hear from one of the most influential voices in my life. So buckle up, put your hands together, and let's give a warm welcome to Pastor John Hampton.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. You guys are kind. Papa, there we go, summer camp with Pastor John. He called me Papa John. Actually, my grandsons call me Pappy, so you can call me Pappy John. Pappy John. Hey, Nona Church, it is so good to be with you again. I was just here in a Memorial Day weekend with you, but it seems like so much has happened in the past few weeks here at Nona Church. First, you just saw that video recapping your Serve Day last Sunday. I think if I got the numbers right, 10 locations were served in your area here. Over 200 people went out the hands and feet of Jesus to serve. I think that's amazing. Give yourself a hand for that. That's awesome. Way to serve. But more importantly, if you missed 2 weeks ago, I think it's a June 25th message, if you missed Big Announcement Sunday, you really need to go back and watch Big Announcement Sunday because it was big. I watched it, and it was just so exciting to see the staff, the new staff Pastor Colin introduced that day, 2 new elder candidates that he introduced that day, the campus leads here at the Moss Park campus and on our Cousy campus, both John and Jonathan. So that is awesome. It was just exciting to hear that. But here's one of the things, as Colin shared a little bit in that message, that a few years ago, meeting in a YMCA, right? So how many, raise your hand if you were, anybody remember those days? Yeah, just a few hands around the room. Remember that. Meeting in a YMCA, right? And now 30,000 square feet of prime ministry space in 2 locations to minister to over 300,000 people in this area. Can we just say, yay, God? I mean, yay, God. That's amazing stuff. And Pastor Colin talked about a video that he showed. And if you watched the message from the 25th, or if you were here, you remember that video. He said, I had to watch that 5 or 6 times because the first 5 times I cried as I watched it. Let me tell you, I got a little emotional watching it as well because I can appreciate the faith journey that God takes a church on. Listen, I work with a lot of pastors. I've connected to a lot of churches. I don't think there's any church that I'm aware of that has a brighter future than Nona Church. And I really mean that. There's not a church that I'm aware of that has a brighter future than Nona Church. So it is a real joy to be able to be with you and share with you here. And we're going to start summer camp today. Are you ready for summer camp? Well, some of you are. We're going to get you ready, all right? Yeah, no, my wife and I were talking on the way over here. My favorite week of summer camp ever was when I met her. I met my wife at a week of summer camp, church camp. So never, pass an opportunity to go to church camp, okay, all you young people out there. We met at church camp, and the next year we were married. So that was my favorite week of church camp. But when I was a kid, my favorite weeks of summer camp were sports camps. I'm a huge sports fan. Pastor Colin and I both have that in common. In fact, Pastor Colin is not just a sports fan. He's an active athlete. Just about a month ago, we met to play golf here at Eagle Creek, and our tee time was like at 8:30 in the morning. He'd already played 2 or 3 games of basketball. He gets up early and goes and plays basketball several times a week. So Colin's not just a sports fan. He is an active athlete. And here's what Pastor Colin and I both know when it comes to sports. The greatest of coaches relentlessly implement the simplest of practices. Let me say that again. The greatest of coaches relentlessly implement the simplest of practices. For example, legendary Green Bay Packer coach Vince Lombardi opened every summer training camp by holding up a football and saying, "Gentlemen, this is a football." He would then review the playbook starting at page 1 and work his way through the basic fundamentals of blocking and tackling with future Hall of Famers and all-pro players, veterans, and rookies. It didn't matter. Lombardi was relentless in implementing the simplest of practices, and he won 5 NFL championships. John Wooden won 10 NCAA titles as the head coach of UCLA men's basketball. He won 7 in a row. I don't think that record will ever be broken. He's called the Wizard of Westwood. On the first day of practice every season with some of the most talented college basketball players in history, like Lou Alcindor, who became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Bill Walton, Gail Goodrich, Sidney Wicks, Walt Hazzard. The first thing Coach Wooden did at the opening practice of every season was to teach them how to properly put their socks on and tie their tennis shoes so they wouldn't get blisters on their feet and miss playing time, because Coach Wooden said, if you can't play, we don't win. The greatest of coaches relentlessly implement the simplest of practices. So today, we're beginning a 3-week message series here at Nona Church where I'm going to teach what may to some of you sound like the most obvious and assumed practices that any follower of Jesus would already know about. But if I've learned anything about working with people in over 42 years of local church ministry, I've learned this: never assume people know things you think they should know. Never assume people know things you think they should know. I think the Apostle Peter had this in mind when he wrote these words. So I will always remind you of these things, even though you know them, Peter says, and are firmly established in the truth you now have. It was C.S. Lewis who said, people don't need to be taught new ideas so much as they need to be reminded of old truths. So I'm going to be very basic and very practical in this summer camp series as I remind you of some of the most foundational truths of what it means to follow Jesus. And we're going to start with that very word, follow. The mission of Nona Church is this. Everybody look on the screen here for just a moment. The mission of Nona Church is to help everyone know and take their next best step in following Jesus. Okay, let's all read this out loud. Let's read it out loud together. Here we go. To help everyone know and take their next best step in following Jesus. Now, while those next steps will be different for everyone, and the journey there will be just as unique, because God doesn't always do the same kind of work, but He always works in the same kinds of ways. And some of you, you're thinking, wait a minute. That doesn't make any sense. How can God always work in the same kinds of ways without doing the same kind of work? God is more concerned with the process of transformation than He is with the products of repetition. In other words, God is not interested in duplicating the same disciples, but He's always interested in making disciples. And the way the disciples are made always involves obvious, intentional, accessible next steps to follow Jesus. Steps like worshiping faithfully, spending time with Jesus daily, connecting in community regularly, serving others unselfishly, giving of your resources generously, and telling your faith story frequently. All of those steps are vital to following Jesus. And we're going to talk about some of them, not all of them, but we're going to talk about some of them over the next few weeks, because here's what I know. No one drifts into a life of discipleship. No one drifts into discipleship. No one accidentally begins to follow Jesus. No one stumbles into a life of faithfulness. That's at the heart of what this short series is about. But today, we begin with the most important and basic step of all. The first step, the I have decided to follow Jesus step. Now, to help us understand this, I want us to look at the opening of the gospel according to Mark chapter 1, verses 16 through 20. And here's what Mark records. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once they left their nets and followed him. When he'd gone a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat preparing their nets. Without delay, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. The word follow is a very strong, robust word in the New Testament. Now, today, the word follow has lost some of its punch, primarily because of how it's used on social media. To say you are following someone on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, it doesn't really mean much, does it? It's another way of saying I see or I read what that person posts. Sometimes I even like what that person posts and I put a little emoji on it. Sometimes I don't like it and I ignore it. But that's about as far as we take the word follow today. Listen, you don't even have to know the person to follow them. But in Jesus' day, following someone, in particular a Jewish rabbi, meant something much more intense, much more intentional and personal. Notice this. When it says these two sets of fishermen brothers, Simon and Andrew, James and John, when they follow Jesus, in both cases, the word that precedes their following is the word left. Look at verse 18. At once they left their nets and followed him. Look at verse 20. They left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. You see, something or someone was left behind in order to follow Jesus ahead. So today in this introductory message to this summer camp series, before we talk about any other steps of what a follower of Jesus looks, sounds, and acts like, I have just one simple question I'd like you to consider on this July Sunday. Here it is. Are you a follower of Jesus Christ? Are you a follower of Jesus Christ? Now, chances are pretty good. Many of you, you've already you skipped right over that question, and you've checked out. You're already starting to scroll for places to have brunch. I mean, this question just doesn't carry much weight or have any real impact on you because you're so familiar with it, you just dismiss it. But don't you look at that question one more time. Look at it again. Are you a follower of Jesus Christ? Kyle Idleman is a pastor in Louisville, Kentucky, and he's the author of a compelling book that came out a few years ago titled Not a Fan. Pastor Idleman says there are basically two different groups of people and two different responses with respect to that question, are you a follower of Jesus? Group one would be the Jesus fish on the back of my car group. Or here in Central Florida, we could say the Z88.3 Safe for the Little Ears bumper sticker crowd. You're serious enough about your faith that you put a Christian sticker or symbol on your car. Asking you if you're a follower of Jesus Christ is like walking into a fraternity house in Gainesville and asking who cheers for the Gators. It's an important question, but you're so sure of your answer that your mind quickly dismisses it. You've already dealt with it. Been there, done that, bought the t-shirt, displayed the bumper sticker. But before you mentally move on too quickly, let me clarify what I'm not asking you. I'm not asking the following. Do you go to church? Are your parents or grandparents Christian? Did you raise your hand at the end of a sermon one time to accept Jesus? Do you own 3 or more Bibles? Have you ever appeared in a church directory? Did you grow up going to VBS and or church camp? Is your ringtone a worship song? When you pray, are you able to utilize 5 or more synonyms for God? Did you get a purpose-driven life in 40 days or less? Do you say, bless their heart, before speaking badly about someone? Here's the point. Many of us are quick to say, yes, I'm a follower of Jesus, but I'm not sure we really understand what we're saying. If you've just assumed you're a follower of Jesus, I pray this message will either confirm that confidence or convict you to reevaluate your relationship with Jesus. But Pastor Kyle Outeman says there's a second group with regard to that question, are you a follower of Jesus? And that question is this: why is there a fish on the back of my friend's car? If you're someone in this group and you come across a question like, are you a follower of Jesus Christ? You also tend to dismiss it and mentally check out, but for other reasons. It's not that you're against the question or even offended by it. It's just that it doesn't seem relevant to you. Unlike the first group, who think they've already answered the question and don't need to wrestle with it, you don't think the question is worth wrestling with. You mean no offense. You're just not into it. I mean, it doesn't bother you that some people choose to follow Jesus. It's their life after all, but it's just not your thing. I mean, kind of like your friends who are so into Star Wars that they can speak and understand the many insider-oriented galactic languages in all the gazillion films and television series spin-offs. I mean, if that's what they're into, good for them. But you don't get the appeal, and frankly, it seems a little weird to you. If that describes you, I want to put your mind at ease from the start. I'm not here to sell you Jesus today. I'm really not. I'm not going to try to talk you into following Jesus by presenting all the benefits of the Christian faith and none of the cost. Because here's the thing. Now, all you Group 2 people, don't tell the Group 1 people that I said this, okay? Many of them assume they're followers of Jesus, but the truth is they only signed up to change their eternity. They didn't understand that Jesus wants to change their life. They think God's greatest concern is to take them to heaven after they die, when the truth is God's greatest desire is to get heaven in them before they die. The gospel is not about an eternal final relocation plan. It's about an internal ongoing transformation process. It's not about where God wants to take you to later. It's about what God wants to do in you right now. But don't tell that first group I said that, okay? So where do you start in figuring out if you are understanding and figuring out, are you really a follower of Jesus Christ? We need to have a little DTR. You know what DTR stands for? Define the relationship. Dating couples understand the DTR concept. And this is the way it usually works. When a man and a woman have been hanging out together for a while, one of them will eventually say, we need to talk. I need to know where this relationship is going. Is this the real deal? Are you the one for me? Or in Nona Church language, they would say, what's the next best step in this relationship? We need to DTR. We need to define the relationship. DTR moments can be awkward. They can be uncomfortable. But eventually, every healthy relationship reaches a point when the DTR talk is needed. Is this just casual, or are we committed? Have things moved past infatuation and admiration towards deeper devotion and dedication? Kyle Oudelman writes, it may seem that there are many followers of Jesus, but if they were honestly to define the relationship that they have with him, I'm not sure it would be accurate to describe them as followers. It seems to me, Oudelman writes, that there's a more suitable word to describe them. They're not followers of Jesus, they are fans of Jesus. The most basic definition of a fan in the dictionary is an enthusiastic admirer. There's a big difference between being an admirer and a follower. An admirer is impressed. A follower is devoted. An admirer applauds. A follower surrenders. A lot of people admired Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Some marched with him. Not many went to jail with him, and not many got their houses bombed like he did. A lot of people admired Mother Teresa. Not many people followed her to live among the destitute and dying in India. Another pastor named Tyler McKenzie writes this: everybody likes talking about love, tweeting about compassion, and virtue signaling about justice. Not everyone likes the inconvenience, time, and consistency it takes to do it. It's socially advantageous and laudable in our culture to seem humanitarian, to have a cause. But do we like the idea of love more than the act? He writes this: as a pastor, I know a compassionate church is made through sweaty brows, dirty hands, achy backs, weekly commitments, and inconvenient schedules. We have to put our money and our muscle where our mouth is. So which are you? Are you a fan or are you a follower? And how did you arrive at your conclusion? Family heritage, biblical knowledge, religious rituals, biased comparisons? You're registered to vote politically with a certain party? Is your faith more about honoring your heritage and your culture than it is about surrendering your heart? Let me ask you this: have you been raised in church but not in Christ? Thankfully, the Gospels record several examples of people having the DTR talk with Jesus. And there is one DTR conversation I want us to spend the rest of our time on today. We read about it in the Gospel according to John. It's the record of a private meeting that Jesus had with one of his fans named Nicodemus. But Nicodemus wasn't just any fan. He was a noted member of the ruling religious elite in Israel, a group called the Sanhedrin, the group that would ultimately decide whether Jesus should live or die. In John chapter 3, we read about Nicodemus's DTR moment with Jesus. The story begins by noting the time of day when he approached Jesus. Look at what the text says. He came to Jesus at night. Hence the origin of the phrase, Nick at night. Why are you laughing about that? You don't know that's not true. You don't know that's not where it came from. It would be easy to overlook this detail and to dismiss its significance. But ask yourself, why would an important, well-known religious ruler come to Jesus at night? He had plenty of opportunities during the day. I mean, Jesus was constantly teaching in public places where it would have been quite convenient for Nicodemus to talk to him for a few moments. In fact, given his position as a religious leader, the other people would have quickly stepped aside for Nicodemus to have some time to talk with Jesus. But John, the writer, says he came to Jesus At night. At night, no one would see him. At night, he would avoid awkward questions from his peers. At night, he could spend time with Jesus without anyone knowing. If he could speak with Jesus at night without anyone else around, maybe he could begin a relationship with Jesus without anyone else noticing. He could talk to Jesus at night and quietly make a decision and accept Jesus in his heart and privately believe in Jesus. That way, it wouldn't disrupt his comfortable, established lifestyle. That sounds like a lot of fans I know. Fans are happy to follow Jesus as long as it doesn't require any significant changes or have negative implications. But here's the truth bomb Jesus is about to drop on Nicodemus. There is no way to follow Jesus without him interfering with your life. There's no way to follow Jesus without him interfering with your life. Following Jesus will cost you something. Following Jesus always costs something. In fact, you're here at church in July, okay? You want to be at summer camp, right? I got a little assignment for all you overachievers who want to get some extra credit in summer camp. Are you ready? I want you to tell me, where in the Bible did God ever give someone an easy job? When did God ever interrupt someone's life and say to them, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jeremiah, Nehemiah, Paul, Timothy, I have an important assignment for you, but it's not going to be very hard and it's not going to take too much time. In fact, you'll be back to your old life in no time at all. I want you to get back with me on your answer. I'll even give you the next week. But I'm going to give you the answer already. He never does. Why? There's no way to follow Jesus without him interfering with your life. For Nicodemus, following Jesus could cost him a powerful position. It could cost him the respect of his coworkers. It could very well cost him his source of income and livelihood. It could cost him friendships. It would very likely cost him some family relationships. And this brings up a very telling question for most fans. And my question is this: has following Jesus cost you anything ever? And listen, I don't mean for that to be one of those preacher rhetorical questions where you nod and say, "That's a really good point, Pastor." I hope somebody's listening to that. Take a moment and give this some serious thought. How has following Jesus interfered with your life? Most of us don't mind Jesus making some minor tweaks in our life. But Jesus doesn't just want to tweak our lives. Friends, he wants to transform our lives. And he's about to make that uncomfortably obvious to Nicodemus. Nicodemus begins his conversation with Jesus by making it clear he has decided Jesus really is from God. And considering this guy's background and the crowd he hangs around with, that's a huge step in his way of thinking. John chapter 3, verse 2, look at this. He came to Jesus at night and he said, "Rabbi, we know," implying that there's others maybe in his circle, "we know that you're a teacher who's come from God. For no one could perform the signs you are doing if God were not with him." He obviously had come to a point of belief that Jesus is from God. That's a good place to start. But where would he go from there? Jesus doesn't make small talk with Nicodemus. He doesn't mince words. He gets right to the heart of what Nicodemus really needs to experience. Verse 3, chapter 3, the Gospel of John. "Very truly, I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they're born again." That would have been hard for this religious leader to hear. I mean, Nicodemus, had memorized the first 5 books of the Bible when he was a boy, like any member of the Sanhedrin would have done. He spent all of his adult life building an impressive religious resume. But Jesus makes it clear to Nicodemus that his righteous acts and religious rituals are not the spiritual metrics of the kingdom of God. Nicodemus must humble himself and be born again into a whole new way of life. Jesus goes on to tell him this: he must be born of water and spirit. Many scholars think this is a reference to the double-sided meaning of Christian baptism, which is a submersion in water that symbolizes an immersion in the Spirit. You see, Nicodemus had made a decision about Jesus. But that's not the same as following Jesus. Jesus would not accept a relationship with Nicodemus where he merely accepted him. Jesus wanted Nicodemus to follow him. Jesus didn't just want Nick at night. He wanted Nick all the time. Let me ask you, are you believing that? Or are you believing in Jesus? Now, some of you say, I'm a little unclear what you're trying to get at here. Are you believing that, or are you believing in Jesus? You see, we tend to define belief as the acceptance of something as real or true. But listen to me. We can believe something is real and true and never rely on it for a single moment. You can believe something is real and true and never rely on it for a single moment. Believing that suggests something is possible. Believing in surrenders to someone personally. Believing that says a plane could fly safely from here to New York. Believing in buys a ticket, takes a seat, and buckles up. Believing that says insulin can help a diabetic. Believing in regularly takes the pill or the injection. Believing that says she seems like a woman you could spend your life with. Believing in buys the ring, pops the question, and walks down the aisle. Friends, Christian faith is more than just an intellectual acceptance or heartfelt acknowledgement of a propositional truth. It is a commitment to follow an actual person. And following someone, by definition, requires more than mere acknowledgement. It calls for actual movement. That's why it's called following. Jesus is looking for more than words of belief. He's looking to see how these words are lived out in your life. When we decide to believe that Jesus, without making a commitment to believe in Jesus by actually following him, then we are nothing more than fans and not followers. So, just before I leave this point, in case someone left it out or forgot to mention when they explained what it means to be a Christian to you, let me be clear. There's no forgiveness without repentance. There's no salvation without surrender. There's no resurrection without a cross, and there's no believing without following. This nighttime meeting ends, and we're really not told at this point what Nicodemus does with his new revelation from Jesus about being born again. But as it turns out, this isn't the last we read of Nicodemus in the gospel record. The next time we meet up with him is found in the same book, Gospel of John, chapter 7. By this point, the popularity of Jesus has grown immensely. And so has the religious rulers' jealousy and envy of him. We read that the Sanhedrin, the Jewish religious elite of which Nicodemus was a member, have assembled, and they're hoping to find a reason to silence Jesus once and for all. You see, part of their role as the ruling council was to judge false prophets. They were looking to drum up some kind of accusation or charge that would indict Jesus as a false teacher. Nicodemus is part of this 72-member group. He's sitting among his peers as they conspire to bring down Jesus. Nicodemus truly believes that Jesus is from God. But would he say anything? Would his belief translate into any kind of commitment? I'm sure he sat there hoping someone else would say something in defense of Jesus. Surely he wasn't the only one who believed. His mind's probably racing with what it would cost him if he goes public with his conviction. And then we read this, John chapter 7, verse 51. Nicodemus actually speaks out in Jesus' defense. Look what he says. Does our law condemn anyone without first hearing him to find out what he's doing? Though he stops short of saying what he fully believes, he does take somewhat of a risk here when he publicly speaks up on behalf of Jesus. This is no longer a private internal conversation about believing that. He's moving toward believing in, and he allows what he believes about Jesus to possibly interfere with his work, his relationships, his financial future. In that moment, he stops being just a fan and he begins the journey of following. And after he speaks out in defense of Jesus, we read in verse 52, the rest of the Sanhedrin responded this way. Are you from Galilee too? Now, I know that doesn't sound like trash talk, right? I know that doesn't seem very harsh to us. But they're clearly trying to embarrass Nicodemus for associating with Jesus. Galilee was a sparsely populated, mostly rural region well north of the city of Jerusalem. Country bumpkin Galileans were looked down upon by religious, elitist Jerusalem city dwellers. I mean, it's like an Ivy League grad looking down on a student at a community college. The Sanhedrin laughed at Jesus because of where he was from, and now they use it to attack Nicodemus. This was meant to be a shot to his ego and a threat to his religious reputation he'd worked so hard to establish. This was a reality check for Nicodemus. I've discovered there is almost always a moment like this for people who want to follow Jesus. They're put in a position where they have to decide between being a fan and being a follower. Any hope Nicodemus had that he could follow Jesus without it interfering with his life was quickly shot down with this one question. Are you from Galilee too? So is that the end of Nicodemus? Did he just shrink back and never say anything else? Never to be heard from again? Well, as it turns out, at the end of John's gospel, there's one more brief reference to Nicodemus that I think definitively answers the question if Nicodemus was merely a fan or a follower. In John chapter 19, we read that what the religious leaders so desperately wanted has now happened. Jesus Christ has been crucified, and his lifeless body is being prepared for burial. A man named Joseph of Arimathea has asked for the body of Jesus to be buried in his family's private tomb. That usually didn't happen to criminals executed by the state. Their corpses were thrown into a common grave together and forgotten about. Up to this point, we've never heard of this guy, Joseph of Arimathea, suggesting that perhaps he himself had been a secret admirer of Jesus, and he didn't want Jesus' remains to be treated disrespectfully. But then we read these fascinating words that I think helps close the loop on Nicodemus' surprising faith journey. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. That's a little funny to me because it's not like there's 10 Nicodemuses in the Bible. There's only one. But John is crystal clear. I'm talking about the same guy that came to see Jesus at night. Yeah, that Nicodemus. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes would have been not only a weighty, but an extremely expensive and costly, over-the-top kind of gesture. But it will cost Nicodemus more than money. There was no longer any concern or opportunity to hide his affection for Jesus. In fact, when Jesus' closest disciples who'd followed him the longest had abandoned him, they're hiding out for fear of their lives, Nicodemus steps forward and he makes this compassionate, courageous, costly gesture of affection and devotion toward Jesus. Nicodemus finally and fully moves from the night to the light. Things had moved past words of belief that he was no longer a secret admirer. He wasn't even just an enthusiastic fan. He'd become a follower. He went all in on Jesus at a time when everybody else ran out. I don't know about you, but I would rather be part of a faith community where the call of wholehearted devotion to Jesus is proclaimed clearly, even if it shrinks down to only a few, than be part of a big crowd of thousands who are content to drift along as admirers of Jesus without ever being challenged to full devotion to Jesus. So I'm going to ask you one more time. Are you a follower of Jesus Christ. Following means taking intentional next steps. And the most important one is the first step. So right now, I'm going to ask if you would, here in the room, maybe those online, would you bow your heads and close your eyes? I want to give you just a few moments just to talk with God right now and search your heart. I know a lot of you, you've already committed your lives to Jesus. And God may be raising some issues that you need to pray about right now. Some things that you need to deal with that you've not dealt with, or you've kicked the can down the road about dealing with it. I want you to go ahead and do that right now. But I want to speak to those of you specifically who've never clearly committed your life to Jesus Christ. You've never confessed your sin and repented and wholly devoted your life to Christ. I want to give you a chance to make that commitment now. And just express it by briefly saying something like this. God, I'm coming out of the crowd. I'm crossing the line from fan to follower. No more playing games. No more half measures. I'm stepping out of the night into your light. I'm fully devoting my life to following Jesus, and I want to express that to you right now. Everybody look up here. If that's your decision, if that's your intent, there's a couple things you can do. Number one, on your seat, on the way in, there was a card that says, I'm all in. I love that. That fits so well with what I'm talking to you about. I'm all in. And this is a card that Nona Church gave out on June the 25th just to help people figure out what campus I'm going to worship. What can I do to help that particular campus? Maybe that's what some of you that's the next step you need to take. You need to take a next step to say, I'm all in there, and this is what I'm going to do as my next step in following Jesus. I encourage you to do that. In fact, after the last service here this morning, there's a blueprint where many people are going to come and just get an orientation again to the vision of Nona and the discipleship strategy. Here's what you can do. If you are deciding right now you want to follow Jesus, you can just write the word follow. Just write the word follow on the card. I know there's not an option to do that. Create your own option. It's okay to do that. Just say, I want to follow. Or after the service, there'll be some folks up front here willing to pray with you, willing to talk with you. Here's what I want to say to you one more time. Nobody drifts into a life of discipleship. No one accidentally begins to follow Jesus. No one stumbles into a life of faithfulness. But it all starts with the first step. I encourage you to take that step today and let this wonderful church family walk with you as you do. Let's stand together right now.